Welcome back to X Squared Radio. I'm your host, Brooks Agnew, coming to you live from just outside of Charlotte. My guest tonight is Diana West. Her book is American Betrayal. And if you have ever taken history in school and thought, oh, gee, what am I going to do? Learning all these dates and these names, what good is it? How can it ever benefit me? I can't wait to get out of this class. My history class was taught by an amazing wrestling teacher in high school, very inspirational. He used to just sit on a stool in front of the class and tell us story after story from history. It was like being there. So if you have a gifted teacher, it can be amazing. And tonight, because we have the amazing investigative work and really incredible speaking mannerisms of Diana West, describing as she follows the trail of this book as she's doing the research for it, it is literally one heartbreak after another as she discovers what really went on. Not what you learned in the press, certainly not what you heard in your history books. This is the real history. And the question is, now that you are informed, now that you are empowered with this information, where do we go from here? What is the value of this information, you as Americans, as really world citizens, because this is a global radio program tonight. We're being listened to live in New Zealand, in Wales, in India, all over the United States, Canada, and even South America, right at this very moment. And people are hearing what's going on behind the curtain, why things ended up the way they did, and discoveries that we never knew, things that just this last Memorial Day weekend, I'm watching Diana West being interviewed on C-SPAN, and I'm in sort of a Memorial Day mood. I'm a veteran myself, come from a family of veterans, and I'm learning about literally the betrayal of our own government from inside our own government. Layers and layers and layers of spies and agents and sources of misinformation to keep us off balance. But we're not ignorant. Presidents were not ignorant. Senate committee chairmen were not ignorant. But there were individuals who thought America meant more than that. There were individuals that came forth, truth tellers, she calls them. And one of those may or may not be a truth teller, but it was definitely one of the loudest voices, and I heard his name mentioned just the other day on television, was Joe McCarthy. Of course, it was used as an anachronism. It was a McCarthyism, and these were calls against the congressional committees, and there are multiple of them now, investigating things like IRS being used to attack conservative groups, Justice Department investigations of members, legitimate members of the mainstream press, and excoriating investigations into what happened in Benghazi, just to name a few. And I heard the term McCarthyism. So let's talk a little bit about the enigma of Joe McCarthy. What was he doing? What was he trying to tell us in those days?
Well, Joe McCarthy is, we have the truth tellers who are the great witnesses, and then we have the great investigators, of whom Joe McCarthy was certainly the leading figure. There were others. There were other senators. There were other congressmen, representatives. They were from both parties. You had Senator Pat McCarran, for example, in the Senate, a Democrat. You had Joe McCarthy, a Republican. You had Martin Dies in the Congress, who opened up the House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1938 to investigate Nazism, fascism, Japanese Shintoism, and communism. And what did Roosevelt do? They had been political allies up to this point. Roosevelt tried to get him to stop investigating communism. When we get up to about 1950, when Joe McCarthy, I have this in the book, it's kind of one of the stunning little moments that are kind of pass in history. Martin Dies in his memoir. He wrote a a memoir in the 60s called Martin Dye's Story. And in that memoir, he discusses being at dinner at an old, vanished, venerable restaurant in Washington named Harvey's on Connecticut Avenue downtown. And Joe McCarthy stopped by his table with his fiancée at the time, the woman he would marry, one of his aides, actually, beautiful aide that he would marry in a couple of years. But they stopped by Martin Dye's table, and Joe McCarthy actually says to Martin Dye, he says, "You know, Martin, I'm thinking of holding some investigations into communism." And he asked for some advice. And I always just think, you know, did lightning strike? Did the earth open up? I mean, what happened at this very moment? It just seems like such a kind of improbable, dramatic, but understated kind of little moment in history. Martin Dye went on to tell Joe McCarthy to expect the worst, to expect to be smeared, to be on the lookout for people trying to set him up, and so on, and gave him very good advice, because what I learned again in Stanton Evans' book, Blacklisted by History, everything that happened to Joe McCarthy had happened first to Martin Dye. But after the war, this is, 12 years later from when Martin Dye opened shop and did very important work in identifying penetration in the years coming up to the war in particular. After the war, something different was going on in Washington. The elites, the White House, whether it was Truman, who followed Roosevelt, or Eisenhower, who followed Truman, all of a sudden, they had secrets to hide. They weren't interested in unmasking the infiltration because it reflected badly on the power structure, whether it was Truman worrying about election year, or Eisenhower at a certain point worrying about whatever he was compromised by, including when we were talking about the POW issue and other matters. The impulse of our government at this point becomes suppression of the truth. That's why I call these people the truth tellers, and on the other hand, you had the investigators like McCarthy, who essentially were functioning very much like, that sort of metaphor that people use with the blind monks trying to feel and describe an elephant. What they were looking at, what they were trying to uncover, what they were trying to bring sunshine to. I mean, we're talking about forces of sunshine, of openness, was a deep, dark secret that the powers that be were doing everything possible to hide. So you had conspiracy happening and conspirators trying to suppress the facts versus the great anti-communists who were trying to bring it into the open. And this is why I believe that the dynamic was so difficult for McCarthy, and why indeed, because he was so popular with the people of this country, why he had to be destroyed, why he had to bear everything he had to bear. And indeed, he was 48 years old, 49, 48 when he died. I mean, this killed him.
Yeah, just literally wore him down until his heart broke.
Yeah, I really think that's true. And indeed, with all this evidence in recent years that has come out that has identified spy after spy, and these were Americans. We call it Soviet-occupied Washington, but of course these were American traitors. When you start looking at these lists and you realize that what McCarthy, as the sort of the symbolic leader of the investigators was doing, he was trying to save America. He was trying to say, I go even farther. In some sense, these people, the Whittaker Chambers, one of the great witnesses, Joe McCarthy, one of the great investigators, what they were looking for, in a sense, was a way to save reality, a way to save our grasp on the truth, on facts. They were trying to bring evidence forward of what was going on, whereas the elites, the pundits, the people who, with publishing houses and newspapers and penthouses and White Houses, all of that, they were trying to tell a lie to the American people and change our grasp on reality. And I don't think there's any accident that at this midpoint of the 20th century is where we start seeing the rise of things like cultural relativism and moral relativism and things like non-judgmentalism. In other words, all things that are ways the human brain avoids facts And that indeed is what undermines our society, and that's where you get the subtitle of my book, really, the secret assault on our nation's character. It's really the insertion of ideology, of ends justify the means ideology, into our institutions, because I actually argue that the recognition of the Soviet Union by Roosevelt in November 1933 was really a turning point for our republic, because it actually required our institutions, our political leadership, to lie. The whole relationship was based on a lie. The actual agreement, it's kind of amazing, Brooks, the actual agreement that finally permitted the American, or that finally determined that the U.S. would recognize Russia, Soviet Russia, 4 presidents before Roosevelt refused, because it was a revolutionary entity designed for our destruction. That was pretty good policy, but Roosevelt reversed it. The agreement was essentially a series of promises the Soviet Union made not to try to overthrow the American government, not to support secret cadres of agents to overthrow the American government, all of which was already underway and would only exponentially increase in the years to come. So in other words, to keep that agreement, America had to pretend that the Soviets were upholding their end of the bargain. And this, I do believe it, big lie begot big lie. And all of a sudden you start seeing double standards in American foreign policy and indeed in society itself. And again, you start seeing a growing complicity. We talked a little bit about Katyn, where America lied for the Soviet Union. We go forward to another betrayal, the repatriation of 2 million Soviet-claimed nationals that America and Britain helped Stalin take back to the Gulag or to be shot. So you see sort of lying, complicity, participation, collusion, and then you see suppression. And I do maintain that this is why when the Soviet Union actually dissolved, you don't see a lot of euphoria in Western elites. And I think part of the reason is that we had a lot to answer for, or really they. I don't consider myself part of that Western elite. They had a lot to answer for, and it was decades of this kind of collusion.
Well, one of the other things that we did not see when the wall fell and somehow we won this economic race that ended up breaking their economy and the internal stress tore them apart, whatever it was, we did not see a major exodus of spies in Washington. They're still there. They're still operating. Now, there may not be a Soviet Union, but there is definitely an anti-American, anti-Western sentiment that is going on. We just saw some of that in Boston a few weeks ago. Now, one of my best listeners writes me and says, "What are some of your own thoughts on how the modern hearings are going and reports on the mishandling of the press, IRS, Benghazi, etc. As you're watching these hearings being chaired by Issa, and you see extremely talented congressmen asking very drilling questions, getting at the truth, what do you make of the hearings that are going on today about the same kind of activities?"
Well, that's a very good question. I've been particularly one of my subjects that I write about in my weekly newspaper, syndicated newspaper column, certainly, and at my website even more so, has been Benghazi. I think probably in the month of October, coming up to the election, I must have written a piece a day about Benghazi, and certainly follow it quite avidly. I have been very disappointed with the line of inquiry to date, because I feel as if it is simply chewing on the edges. The main preoccupation of the investigation to date has been on what they call security failures, as if to say having better guards would have made everything all right, or listening to the complaints about the security would have been all right. Benghazi is a very complex issue. It's multi-level. I mean, it's many, many dimensions. What is not being looked at, and what I do not believe will be looked at, and this to me is the tragedy, and actually what takes us back to a good parallel with the communist struggle. We are not looking at the ideological policy that put America in support of al-Qaeda in Libya, that led us to a situation where the U.S. compound in Benghazi was being guarded by jihadists on the inside. I'm speaking specifically of the February 17th Martyrs Brigade. February 17th Martyrs Brigade was the security force presented to us by the Libyan government. February 17th Martyrs Brigade, just so you know what it is, it commemorates a February 17th back in 2006 when Benghazi rioted against the Italian consulate in protest of the Italian minister Roberto Calderoli having declared solidarity with the Danish cartoonists and free speech. He had gone on Italian TV and said that the Western world has free speech and you can draw cartoons, essentially, and this is just something the Islamic world has to recognize, that we have free speech in the West. And indeed, he showed that he was wearing a T-shirt with not the Danish cartoons. It was kind of an ecumenical cartoon that depicted various religious leaders, including Muhammad. And he said, I'm keeping this shirt on until the Islamic world recognizes free speech. Well, immediately, the Friday after, Friday prayers in Benghazi, the people were ginned up so that thousands of people protested, very similarly to the way they did our compound, protested the Italian consulate. They burnt it. The Italians had to be evacuated at risk for their lives. Gaddafi's army at the time, or police, was still in force, and they fired on the crowd at a certain point, and maybe a dozen of the Benghazians were killed. Those are the martyrs. That's who's named for the people guarding our people in Benghazi. That's just the very beginning of this problem.
Wow.
Libya Shield, another militia, another jihadist militia. They fly the black flag of Al-Qaeda. Hillary Clinton gets a stray question about that, and she actually tells the Congress, well, we have to support anti-jihadists no matter what color their flag is, words to that effect. Not even getting to the point where if you fly the black flag of jihad, it's likely that you are indeed a jihad. Look at the triumph there of deconstructionism. I mean, it's really pretty profound.
Well, the assertion,
our late ambassador, yeah.
Well, I was going to say the assertion that Al Qaeda was not active, that there was, that this was
a lie.
Yeah, it was absolutely all fabricated, and that everyone in the public knows this, and knew it within probably 2 days of when it occurred, and that's why when Ambassador Rice hit the airwaves that Sunday, I've never actually seen that done. 5 Sunday shows by one person. It was everybody knew it was all propaganda, and they even arrested the guy, and I think he's still in prison.
He's in jail. He's got a year-long sentence. He's serving. I maintain he's serving. He's an American in prison for having violated Islamic law against criticizing Muhammad. This was a sop to the Islamic world. But you see, what we have here is an ideological policy that actually put us on the side very openly of Al-Qaeda in Libya. We overthrew Gaddafi, who was an anti-jihadist at this point in his career, and we gave no-fly zones and support and training and weapons to people in Benghazi, where it is known the concentration of Benghazi martyrs, quote marks around martyrs, and fighters who went to Iraq to fight Americans is the highest in the world. You have the militias in Libya that we supported, very close to Al-Qaeda, various hierarchies, colluding and in touch with the people who did the London underground bombings, the Madrid train bombings. This is who America supports in Libya. Indeed, this is the policy of the Arab Spring. Is Congress asking questions about this policy shift that has openly put the United States on the jihad? No, they're not. There was one line of questions came from Representative Arenholt of Texas when he had the 3 so-called whistleblowers from the State Department. And it was I actually wrote a whole column up just about that, because it was sort of like this window that opened on this very issue. And then I've seen no follow-up. But basically, he was asking, why did we have February 17th Martyrs Brigade? Are they jihadists? Why did we have them guarding? And indeed, it was Nordstrom who went very strongly and in no uncertain terms say, this is what we do everywhere. We do it in Saudi Arabia. We do it in Yemen. Mm-hmm. We have it in Afghanistan. This is the policy. And it was sort of like this eureka moment but then the line of questions is over in 5 minutes, and I've seen no follow-up. Now you have the committee still chewing on the edges of, weren't you told you needed more security? I mean, it's kind of like, I think, in some ways, a giant act of misdirection on their own part. Yes, there are lapses, yes, and so on. And yet it's the policy. The policy of this administration was not to have American uniforms on the ground because it might arouse the locals to jihad. However, we insert diplomats there to try to see if they can, kind of tame the tiger. It's an insane policy, and it's a grotesque policy when you think about the fact we're supporting people who just a year or two earlier were in Iraq blowing up our troops.
Right. It's appeasement, just the same kind of policy. You feed your friends to the alligator hoping it will eat you last.
Yes.
And let's do what you did in your book. Let's look at the map. Libya is not all that important. I mean, it has a lot of oil, but strategically, as far as taking over the Middle East, is inconsequential. What is important is that there is a center of conflict known as Syria, and Syria is the ancient, seat of the prince of the Middle East. It's often said, as Egypt goes, so goes the Middle East. Just parenthetically, I was in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, a couple of weeks before the Arab Spring erupted. We were sitting on the wall outside the Museum of Egypt, or Museum of Cairo. And, the prayer starts at 5 o'clock over the speakers, and it's kind of pleasant, to hear the singing. And then the singing ends, the prayer's over. And another guy takes the microphone, and he begins speaking in Arabic. And, I live in the South here in North Carolina. And from time to time on AM radio on Sunday mornings, you get to hear a Southern preacher throw down some fire and brimstone. Well, that's what this began to sound like, a little bit like Arabic fire and brimstone. So I asked my guide, who's a female, and she's with our group of 11. And I said, so what is he saying exactly? And she listens for a moment, and she goes, well, he's just speaking to the people, about something coming up, some big event coming up. And I said, no. I know Arabic. I know enough Arabic to know what's going on. Not exactly what he's saying, but it's the way that he's saying it. It sounds like he's preaching, like he's trying to rouse people up. What is he saying? And so she listened a little bit more, and then she said, I think we need to get back on the bus. And so we all got back on the bus and we left. And 3 days later we flew out, and 5 days later the whole Arab Spring erupted. The tension of what was going to happen was already happening over the mosques and the prayer things all over Egypt. And that's what got everybody riled up. That's what made it happen. So let's look at the map again. We have Syria as this seat of conflict. And I don't know if you've seen the pictures coming out of Syria, but it looks like southern Russia during World War II. It is completely bombed out. Every street, every restaurant, every apartment is laid to waste. There is nothing, not a blade of grass, not an electric light, nothing left. It is amazing how devastated that place is. But Libya has 20,000 rockets, grenades, shoulder-fired missiles, the latest and best stuff, because Gaddafi's wealthy. It's sitting there in Libya, all free contraband. And it is now becoming widely known that Stevens was making a deal with Turkey to move those weapons through Turkey into Syria to be used by Al-Qaeda. And that's why everyone in the compound was either killed or is in sequestration right now.
I'd like the Congress to, push that. I mean, Stevens, and I'm a big fan of. I read a lot of WikiLeaks, and frankly, one of the things I learned in doing this book was I would like to see WikiLeaks. I would like to see a lot. I would like to see our archives just opened up. There is just much in our archives that there's no reason for secrecy except to spare the U.S. government embarrassment, and that's not a reason for secrets when you're supposed to be a democratic republic. But I went through quite a lot of cables that Christopher Stevens wrote through the years, and he was of the mind, I became convinced that he could use these al-Qaeda people, he could use these jihadists late of either Afghanistan or or literally from Guantanamo that were repatriated to Libya early on, even still during the Bush years. And there's a strange sympathy that comes through his cables for them, for these fighters. And you see the wheels turning, and his realization that if we only got rid of Gaddafi, they would be happy. They would like us. You almost get the feeling. I feel that he was either sympathetic to them or he was played by them, but he was certainly talking nonsense in terms of failing to appreciate the doctrinal, the Islamic, the cultural cult of jihad in these societies. And this is actually another kind of betrayal in the sense that our government, since 9/11, has made it an official policy to ignore Islam as an enemy threat doctrine. What I found in my research was that this was identical to what was going on during World War II when communism was similarly whitewashed. It's really kind of an amazing thing. There were no anti-communist books published during World War II. There was just a moratorium on anything critical. Anything that was not positive was thrown out, ostracized, even to the point of, this was really amazing, Trotsky's biography of Stalin, which was going to come out with Harper Publishers in 1941. The review copies were out. Trotsky, of course, had been murdered by Stalin while he was finishing the book, and in fact, I read and found out that blood from the ice pick driven into his head actually had spattered on his manuscript, and they had to put the thing back together with blood on it. This book was put together, it was coming out, and when we became official allies, Cass Canfield, the publisher of Harper at the time, very famous New York publisher, wrote letters to reviewers and asked them to return the review copies and not mention the book. This is what was going on, the whitewashing of communism. Similarly, actually worse, in our time, we have a whitewash of Islam to a point where our security agencies are forbidden to train, to understand jihad, to have educational materials that I think would even exclude the Quran. The problem, the worst, the place where we are actually at a greater disadvantage is in the old days, you had an anti-communist FBI. You had Hoover was the, super anti-communist of the age. He understood it. He was a student of it. His agency was following it. In our time, under William Mueller, you have a de-Islamized FBI. You have an FBI structure where Islam is verboten. And so in a sense, we are actually at a greater disadvantage, more willfully blind even than we were in the 1940s.
Wow. So when we had this agent drain, or an agent maybe change hands inside all of the agencies of the United States after the Cold War was over, and hundreds, perhaps thousands of agents that were inside of Washington, D.C. didn't just sell their homes and move away. Maybe they just went back to normal lives. It's hard to tell. But any of you that have been to Detroit or been to the Beltway in Atlanta or Houston or any of these places will notice that there are a lot of Islamists everywhere, and they're not coming in broke. They're coming in and they're buying up properties, whole city blocks, and they're moving in, and they are supplying hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars to startup companies in the United States, ostensibly to create jobs, but they're in key industries. And anybody wonder why Iran was able to fly an RQ-170 stealth drone and land it at their own airport just by taking over the joystick and flying it home? People, let's put the dots together here.
Right.
This is really, really powerful stuff. And this book, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character, is the can opener that is opening the can of worms that makes up our, what do you call it, Swiss cheese government that we're seeing right now.
It is. It is. I mean, I actually, particularly since 9/11, I'm a journalist. I write this column. I've been chronicling the Islamization of the West ever since 9/11. And I actually set out, when I was trying to do my research under the title The Hollow Center, I was actually trying to understand how it could be that you could mine and study all of these facts about jihad, about Islam, about the experience of Jews and Christians living under various Islamic regimes over centuries, over continents. There's a commonality here, and that is the evaporation of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, equal protection under the law. These are the things that disappear under Islamic law, just no way around it. I was trying to understand how it could be that you could sort of present this evidence and nothing would happen, in the sense, in what I mean by that is no one would draw a conclusion, in public anyway, that Islam was anything other than a religion of peace. 9/11 happens, the government says Islam is a religion of peace. In the public square, all people do is rearrange the facts to support this preposterous notion, this propaganda. So I was trying to figure out, do we have historical precedent for this? Is there a period of time where this kind of completely anti-logical process took hold? This is when I started going back in time and realizing there's so many commonalities between our period and the period of the communist struggle, which does include World War II, unbeknownst to Americans who go through the public and private school system, for that matter. Stalin was always at war with the United States. We thought he was our ally, but there was an intelligence war going on, and we had different war goals. This is why, Brooks, it sounds extremely overbearing to say so, but the research that comes out of the intelligence archives that confirms all of this intelligence war that I try to reweave into our general history in this book, American Betrayal, it actually invalidates the tons of history books that have been written that have not taken into account this intelligence war being waged by the Soviet Union the whole time. Because
no question about it.
Yeah, all of these books, these conventional stories, assume that we all had the same war goals and that, everything was hunky-dory until after the war. And when you actually learn that there was a vicious war underway, waged by Stalin against us from the start, well, even before the start of the war, but certainly during the war, everything looks different. And that is, again, where you end up with this notion of betrayal. But the parallels with today, the mindset, the denial, what happens to truth tellers, you try to tell the truth about Islam, you lose your job in the FBI or the Pentagon.
Sure.
In the past, you had anti-communist officials purged. It's strange. The State Department used to have anti-communist officials. The foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Litvinov, comes to the American government in 1943 with a list of anti-communist American officials in the State Department and asks that they be purged. Well, they were. They were gone. One went to Iraq, one went to Turkey, one went to Canada. The libraries were broken up. The files were dispersed. Some of these men actually hung on to some of the files, but they were supposed to be destroyed. You had this all going on. Similarly, today, you had Muslim groups going to John Brennan, at the time President Obama's security advisor, back in fall of 2011. He presents a similar kind of list of trainers considered anti-Islamic, training materials they wanted purged. What do you know? It was done.
Yeah, they're all gone.
Well, is uncanny.
So we're not learning from history, but maybe the listeners to tonight's program and the readers of your book will do just that. Now, let me ask you another question, because this book sounds like it would be a hell of a screenplay. Is anyone from Hollywood talking to you about a screenplay, and are you looking for a screenwriter?
Well, funny you should ask. Someone from Hollywood is talking to me, but I probably can't say more than that.
That's all. That's good enough. I've not written many screenplays, but it is not easy to do. And one of the things that we do with film, Hollywood in this country, is we we make rather powerful political statements. And usually, and this goes all the way back to World War I, when movies were just, being popularized, and certainly in World War II because it was an escape from reality. And even in books, we did political satire, we did political expose, but now it has gone the other way. It's almost as though Hollywood is the central propaganda outlet for the world. And I'm talking about everything from brain-eating aliens to bungling, stupid Arabs, trying to hijack a Harrier jet with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Roseanne Barr's husband, battling them.
Right.
Nothing could be further from the truth. We're talking about billions of dollars of Saudi money being poured, not trickled, poured into our country right now, actually for about the last 10 years. And the results are showing up in almost every major city in the country, from Montana to Florida, all over D.C. You want to know what the number one selling cars inside the Beltway are? Lamborghini, Maserati, Ferrari, number one dealerships in the nation. Those aren't politicians buying those. Those are lobbyists buying those.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, the power of mass media is enormous, of course. It was certainly manipulated during World War II for the war effort. But in terms of the communist infiltration, we usually focus on, this communist screenwriter got a little Marxist propaganda into a script. That actually is not what they really were successful at. What they did, and they bragged about it, Dalton Trumbo, the most talented, to be sure, of the Hollywood 10, the unfriendly communist witnesses, was a screenwriter, and he bragged in 1946 that what they had managed to do was keep the great anti-communist novels and books from being made into movies. They had communists in the script writing, the script vetting machinery. They had communists at the government sort of censorship boards. They had communists certainly in the writers' colony. It was an intensive movement to hide communist reality, and so therefore you never saw a movie of Darkness at Noon, for example, Arthur Koestler's great book, great novel. You never saw Red Army atrocities. If you think about all the movies made, and you think back of 100 million people killed by communism in the 20th century, it is amazing to realize that you have very likely never seen a communist army committing atrocities, whereas you have seen probably more Nazi atrocities on the screen because of all the years that have gone by than actually could have been, incidents during that 12-year span of the Reich. We have Nazi villains to this day, and we still don't have communist villains in movies. It's an amazing accomplishment of the propaganda machine.
Yeah.
I can think of only one movie, a really great movie, Night Without Armor, a movie with Marlene Dietrich and Robert Donat, where you actually see Red Army, mowing down people. But it's the only one I can think of. That's what they accomplished, the whitewash of that regime.
Well, we had Red Dawn come out in the 80s, and that's where Russia was attacking the United States. But even then...
It was in the future, too.
Yeah. And the main communists in the movies were actually Cubans, not Russians. And then you had Red Dawn 2 come out. It got funded, it got scripted, it got casted, and it was partially shot. But China did not want China being portrayed in the movie. And so China came and asserted their money and had all of the flags and emblems changed in the movie digitally to North Korean.
Right, I remember that. That's extraordinary. The first movie that ever, to my knowledge, ever actually treated the experience of communism in Eastern Europe was The Lives of Others, which was made by a young German filmmaker. You never had that done. You had no grown-up assessment, no grown-up stories about this incredible dramas, whether it was Cubans trying to flee Cuba, whether it was people trying to get out from the Iron Curtain. It's as if it didn't exist in our popular consciousness, which I write about quite a lot, about this shaping of the public consciousness so that there's no context. When you finally have, a Solzhenitsyn come out and talk about his experience, and no one could not look at the riveting Solzhenitsyn, it sounded kind of crazy to people who hadn't been prepared all along the way with the truth.
Exactly right.
And I think the same is going on with Islam.
And I'm glad you brought up the word grown up, because there was a book that was written, highly popularized, and made into several movies that was a satire on the economic takeover of the United States and the industrial and farming and political landscape. And it was The Wizard of Oz. It was L. Frank Baum's political satire.
Yeah.
And nobody caught it. And nobody remembers, because they don't read the book, they just watch the movies, that Dorothy's slippers were not ruby. They were silver. She was supposed to click her silver heels together 3 times in order to go home. In other words, put us back on the silver standard.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with rubies.
Right. Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very cool observations. And I think media is, unfortunately, how most people learn their history. Forget about the cliff notes. Let's watch the movie.
Well, it's true, and again, I kept feeling personally betrayed by this material as I was sitting in my study, usually in the dark by myself, looking at all of this. But you realize how robbed we are as a people, as a culture. We don't have the lore, we don't have the tradition, we don't have the stories. We don't have the stories, and I was so struck. Solzhenitsyn wrote at a certain point about how he doesn't consider the censored literature of the Soviet period to be literature because it's not telling the truth. It doesn't tell the full story.
Ah, right.
And when I think about his words, and I think, my gosh, we are in the same predicament. We don't have our lore either. Our stories, maybe they're self-censored, but they are just as empty. They are just as devoid of the full story as even a gulag nation like the Soviet Union. And I constantly wonder, what is this power over a free people? We don't have police knocking at the door, at least not yet. We don't have a gulag over these years putting people away who step out of line in journalism or media, writing, and so on, movies. What is this power? And you realize it is a subversion of the mind, and it's a soft totalitarian mindset.
Yeah, it's not so soft if you talk to David Rosen. He's
right.
in a fight for his
Exactly.
life right now.
Right.
Absolutely amazing. The book is American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, everywhere where fine books are sold. I'm sure it's going up the charts on the New York Times list as well. Diana West has been my guest. Is there anything that you would like to add that you never get to add in any other interviews? Because we've certainly gone places in this interview just because we like to talk about this subject here. Is there anything you would like to add in the last 10 minutes?
Well, I know it's a lot for people to digest, and it's always funny. I mean, you've given me, thank you for this luxury of time to actually try to develop some of this. But imagine when you're actually trying to rewrite 20th century history in, a 10-minute radio spot. It's very shocking to people when they first hear it. Again, I spent 4 years writing this book, and it's about 400 pages. I've got almost 1,000 footnotes because it is such a hair-raising story. My editor was kind of funny. With book publishing the way it is, there are certain cost-cutting measures taken. Some books are actually putting footnotes online to save paper and so on. And my editor said, no way, we have to have all the footnotes in your book.
They do make you take the pictures out, though.
This. But I guess I would just hope that people, come into this with an open mind and kind of just sit back and try to allow all the predispositions, all the conditioning that we are all subject to relax a little and again, try to follow the logic where it leads. We're logical human beings, and I just feel that we have been conditioned to a point of, well, liberty is very hard to hold if we are not cognizant of what is going on, and I guess that is the bottom line of this book and the message. Don't believe everything you hear.
Well, it's
Read it
often
for
said,
yourself.
especially with this recent Memorial Day, freedom isn't free. And that, from time to time we have to fight for it. But literally, we would not ever have to put a uniform on and march over anyone's beach anywhere if we would just be true. If we would just tell the truth and be true with your people, you would never have to do that.
Yeah, and I would just hope that Americans at a certain point realize that, they have the power. I feel like Congress has the power. I feel like not going with the silver shoes, but just in terms of the old-fashioned ruby slippers or the new-fashioned ruby slippers, Congress has the power if they just simply click their heels together. They have subpoena power. They have select committee power. They have the power to get affidavits to make the record true. And, I fear that they don't have the real political courage that it takes.
Yeah, they don't have the resolve. But, you keep in mind that it is illegal for Congress to talk directly with the agencies. They have to haul them into some committee meeting before they can get anything resolved. And all they have to do is say, I don't know, and that's the end of that. All these agencies, departments, bureaus, and administrations have the ability to write regulations that have the force of law, and you are not represented in any of those agencies. So you can be taxed, fined, jailed, silenced, have all your stuff confiscated, and you have no representation in that government.
Yeah, it's amazing. Something's really wrong, and you just hope that Americans care enough to set things right. I guess that's really one of the question marks we have. We don't know if enough Americans care to put things right.
Well, let's hope that they do. One thing is for sure, one author does, and I am so grateful that you wrote this book.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you about it, and it's kind of, it's a relief after all these years of being alone with this material to share it, I have to tell you.
You have friends here at X Squared Radio. This is the whole idea behind X Squared is that it's a mathematical function into which any number can be placed. It will come out positive. So we're not trying to take cheap shots at the government or tear down anybody. What we're trying to do is empower you as listeners and readers so that you can help us stay free and help us avoid making the mistakes of the past. Now we see the mistakes and the secrecy and espionage and subterfuge that went on during the Cold War, and we're watching exactly the same thing go on with this, I'm going to call it a ghost war, because we really don't have soldiers fighting anybody. It's just an ideological war, exactly as Diana has said.
Yes, well, we still have soldiers in Afghanistan, and we still have soldiers paying the price in hospitals where they will be in and out for the rest of their lives. These are our forgotten soldiers today. And I guess, the thing that's probably most important notion to revive, I think, in Americans is notions of accountability, holding generals accountable. General Petraeus, we find out, is now going to some fancy Wall Street firm after his fall from grace. I was put in mind of the famous British cabinet minister Profumo, who in the 60s was involved in a terrible affair with a woman named Keeler, who was also involved with the Soviets, and it brought the government down, this affair. And Profumo, after resigning in disgrace, as Petraeus resigned in disgrace, Profumo went to the East End of London, where the impoverished sections are, and cleaned toilets. He went into charity work, and he literally went into menial labor to atone. And then that's what I was thinking when I saw that General Petraeus is not atoning. He's taking a fancy Wall Street job.
I reckon so, and he doesn't have to testify in Benghazi. By the way, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, along these same lines, make sure to watch what happens to number 10 Downey Street.
Oh, what's going on there?
What you just said. An affair that's going to take a government down.
Oh, okay. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. We get all the hottest stuff right here. Thank you so much for coming on X Squared Radio. I had a wonderful time. I enjoyed the book, and I enjoy you immensely.
Well, thank you. I hope to come back sometime.
Absolutely. Open invitation. As you're doing your investigations, if anything comes up emergency, you have an open mic here anytime.
Great. Thank you so much, Brooks.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
All right, that was Diana West. Her book is available on St. Martin's Press, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. We have about 2 minutes. I decided to close the phone lines down the last hour because we were really making good progress, and I was afraid somebody would call up and ask a question that had nothing to do with the program. I hope that you enjoyed it. One little piece of news. There is a potential pandemic out there working. 2 respiratory viruses in different parts of the world have captured the attention of global health officials, a novel coronavirus in the Middle East and a new bird flu spreading in China. Both of these nations send a lot of people to this country. If you're traveling by airplane, this is a virus, so if it wouldn't be socially uncouth to wear a mask. They're packing people in these planes, no open seats. You're going to be stuck in an aluminum can at 39,000 feet with somebody that's got this H7N9 virus. It's already caused 32 deaths out of 131 known cases. It's already in the United States, in Houston, and also on the East Coast. So watch out. It can be spread from human to human. So be careful out there. We'll see you next week right here on X Squared Radio. We've got about 30 seconds left. I guess I have time for one quick update or one quick note. The Breakthrough Energy Movement Conference is coming up in October, on October 10th in Boulder, Colorado. You can access the registration in a couple of weeks. It's right there at X Squared Radio, x2-radio.com. Make sure to click on the link in the middle of the site. Go there, become familiar with it. There's going to be a lot of firsts there. The new trailer for Atlas Shrugged 3 is going to be premiered there. There's going to be electric vehicles there. There's going to be breakthrough energy, like things you have never seen before. Come, be fascinated, have your mind opened, and by all means, stay informed. Look for the good in others and help it to grow a little bit every day. And before long, you will have saved the planet. We'll see you next week right here on X Squared Radio.